All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to another exciting episode of D&D Deep Dive, the show where we dive deep into classes, subclasses, and other features of 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons to help you get the most out of your choices. So, today, we are actually going to be doing something different. I'm not covering a class. I'm not covering a subclass. I'm not doing feats, anything like that. Because I spent something like 6 months, I think, covering all of those homebrews for the Final Fantasy 14 cross did a D&D thing. I got to deal a lot with homebrews, and I myself, without bringing them to D&D Deep Dive, I've looked over a ton of homebrew material for 5th edition D&D. I wrote my own homebrew. I have my own homebrew class. It has 5 subclasses thus far. I made a homebrew subclass for the monk that was really bad, but it exists. And I'm very invested in 5th edition, and I understand the game better than most. I will go out and say, and one of the things I pride myself in is being able to just look at something without playtesting it, and for the most part, being able to tell, okay, this is balanced or this is unbalanced. And I get that from doing this for years and years and years, and from the extensive amount of actual live play experience I have from running my own games, from doing the conventions as a circuit, from being an Adventurers League local coordinator, from running the D&D program at multiple stores. I've learned all of this stuff, and one of the biggest mistakes I see a lot of people making when they create homebrew materials is they don't understand what is there already, and they don't understand what it is that they're modifying. Even a lot of people that make up their own classes, they're not really new classes. What they are is they take abilities from different classes and smush them together because they don't like the multi-classing system and the limitations it brings. And I mentioned before, that doesn't work, because the reason there are limitations to the multi-classing system is because they're necessary for balance and to make everything unique. So, starting today, I am starting a new kind of sub-series in D&D Deep Dive where we're going to talk about how to homebrew each class. They're going to be divided into 2 different episodes. The first episode is going to be talking about the defining features, why they're defining features for the class itself, and then talking about just the stuff presented in the player's handbook about how those subclasses modified those defining features. And then the second episode is going to go into additional subclasses that have been introduced in other ways through different books and things like that, and other examples of that class or that style of class, either from the past of D&D and from other systems that just haven't been represented yet in 5th edition D&D, to kind of give you some ideas about, okay, these are some ways that these things have been modified. And that's what a subclass should do when you are modifying, when you're creating new subclass, you should be modifying these defining features in some way, or creating a new somewhat defining feature that interacts with these defining features. So I'm hoping that this will encourage a lot of people to maybe try their own homebrewing, and that it will provide a little bit more insight so that other people can kind of look at homebrews and things like that and go, hey, I definitely like the idea behind this, but it's not going to fit in my game for this reason or that. But now that I understand kind of the why underneath all of this stuff, I can modify it so it can be used in my game. One of my least favorite things to do to an excited player is for them to go, hey, I want to play this homebrew. And you look at it and the homebrew is just completely broken. And having to just say, no, you can't do that. I hate that. It's not fun. But being able to look at something and go, hey, you can't play this version. This version won't work because it's broken. It's not balanced correctly. You know, the abilities don't work the way they're supposed to. It's written poorly, whatever it is. But if this is the kind of character you want to play, I can make something for you. We can modify this, or I can start something from scratch. Because having that ability really means that your players are going to feel that much more special. They're going to be that much more invested in their characters, because now it's not just a bunch of abilities that they put together because the numbers worked correctly. Now it's something that they have helped create and design. It is something that is personal to them. So, that being said, wow, I wonder what class we should start with. I mean, we could start alphabetically and go with but no, I mean, that's kind of boring. We could, oh, I know, let's do the monk. Anyone that's been watching this long enough, I'm a monk main. I like monks. They're super fun. I have played monk characters all the way going back to 2nd edition as far as video games are concerned. I've made 2nd edition monks. I've made 3rd edition monks. I've made 4th edition monks. And in 5th edition, I have made many monks. I love monks. And the 5th edition version of the monk is my favorite version of the monk in D&D, because it really allows you to play that kind of character that I really enjoy. You know, the idea of that kind of wushu fictional movie style martial artist. You know, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Journey to the West style adventuring, things like that. That's what the 5th edition monk can do, and it does it better than any previous version of the monk. So let's dive into what makes the 5th edition monk the 5th edition monk. Hold on one sec. I need to get water. All right, sorry. Water. All right, much better. So, quick refresher on 5th edition class design. In 5th edition, every class is designed to play very, very differently right from the beginning. Normally, I have a second half to that statement, but I want to stop because we're talking about homebrew, and this is an essential part of homebrewing, is the idea that every class should play very, very differently right from level 1. What that means is, if you're designing a new class, like what I did with my Dragon Knights, I had to come up with something that was entirely different than anything currently out there. Because if it is like, well, you know, I want to make a new class where it's kind of like a monk, but instead of being, you know, all, you know, martial arts based, it's actually gun based. So it can kind of be like a Matrix style monk. Okay, that would be a very, very different thing, but monk already exists. So if you're going to make a completely separate class, it needs to have nothing in common with the monk. The only time you ever make a new class in 5th edition to the D&D is if you can't already do what you want to do using something from other classes. If your new class is like, well, you know, I'm going to use this from this other class, don't make a new class. Make it a subclass of whatever class you're borrowing from. There is a lot of versatility in subclasses that people don't really seem to understand. And I see this a lot when, over a year ago now, when I was doing the thing where I was talking about this Pathfinder 2nd edition monk versus the 5e monk. I was having a conversation with someone that's really, really invested in and very, very knowledgeable of Pathfinder Second Edition. And one of the things that they were kind enough to do was they actually made a bunch of different Pathfinder monks for me to kind of show how, you know, how much more customizable Pathfinder is than D&D 5th edition. And what invariably happened was what they did was they created some Pathfinder monks, and they created a 5th edition monk. And one of the statements I heard all over again is like, and then I'm going to make a 5th edition monk, which is the exact same as every other 5th edition monk. And that is completely untrue. I have built many, many monks. None of them play remotely similarly. You know, my Shadow Monk, I currently have 2 different monks on my D&D Beyond account. I have 2 monks that I am updating. The first one, I'm not updating anymore because I haven't played him in years. The first one is Aether. That is my Shadow Monk. The second one is a character I won't entirely reveal because it's something special about it for me personally. But it is a Way of the Open Hand monk. The 2 monks play massively differently. Like, from turn 1 in combat, they do massively different things. They don't use the same weapons. They don't use the same attacks. They don't even look at combat the same way. And the big difference between the 2 of them is the subclass. Now, I have different feats for them as well, which again makes a really big difference. But the idea that all monks are the same, which is a little bit of a flavor, all rogues are the same, which is a little bit of a flavor, shows a complete lack of understanding of how 5th edition works. The subclass modifies the defining feature in a way that will drastically alter how you play the class. And the best subclasses do that in a unique and surprising way. So, if you are thinking about building a homebrew class in D&D 5th edition, look at what already exists. And if you go, you know what, I really like this, but it doesn't quite let me do what I want to, make a subclass for that class. Don't try and make your own class that all it is a conglomeration of different things from different classes, because it's not going to work. 5th edition is remarkably well designed. And there are so many things that if you don't understand the system, you don't understand how they interact, and taking them out and putting them somewhere else is going to cause interactions that you won't be able to anticipate because you don't understand the original interactions. So I'm going to say this again. In 5th edition, every class is designed to play very, very differently right from the beginning. In order to do that, classes have what we call defining features. Now, a defining feature is either something unique to the class, or maybe it's not unique, but it's something that the class gets to use differently than other classes, or perhaps gets earlier than other classes. And in order for something to be a defining feature, it needs to show up within the first 2 levels. The reason I put that little extra emphasis of defining features only exists in the first 2 levels is because of the idea that every class is designed to play very differently right from the beginning. If you play 3rd edition D&D or Pathfinder or anything based on the D20 system that was released with the 3rd edition, at first level, all weapons-based classes, for the most part, play the same. All spellcasting classes, for the most part, play the same. It isn't till around level 3 or 5 that you really start feeling like you are your own class. Sorcerers, wizards, not really bards, because bards are a lot different in earlier versions. Even warlocks, they all effectively play the same. You have some different spell choices, and generally you're going to have a different number of spell slots available to you. But when you get to brass tacks, when initiative is rolled, you're going to do the exact same thing no matter which one of those classes you are. The same thing is true about fighter, paladin, ranger, even rogues. They're all going to play effectively the same until you start kind of specializing and doing other things. And in 3rd edition, you really don't start to feel unique until you start taking advanced classes. Which I can't remember if that's what they were called then, but that's the word that's coming into my mind. So if I'm getting the wrong word, prestige classes. There we go. Prestige classes. In 5th edition, starting as a monk versus starting as a barbarian or starting as a fighter is going to feel different. You're going to make different choices right at level 1. That is an essential part of 5th edition. It's one of the reasons I like 5th edition better than other editions, because you actually can start at level 1 and feel unique from your other party members, whereas in earlier editions you couldn't. 4th edition was exceptionally good at that, but 4th edition was a completely different beast. Not saying it's bad, but it was very, very different. So, what are the defining features of the monk? Well, there are 4 different features that the monk gets at 1st and 2nd level. They are Unarmored Defense, Martial Arts, Ki, and Unarmored Movement. And 3 of those things are modified by a different player's handbook subclass. And so that's what we're going to focus on. The first one that I don't always consider a defining feature, but it kind of is, because this is shared with the barbarian, but they do it in different ways. So according to the definition I just stated of defining feature, this is one, and it's Unarmored Defense. Unarmored Defense allows the monk to not require armor to have a decent armor class. Now, people that don't like the monk, that think it's super underpowered, tend to mess around with Unarmored Defense, because martial arts and, by definition, Ki, require you to not be wearing armor. So if your monk was to get proficiency in armor of some way, it removes their ability to use the rest of their defining features. So because of that, at tier 2 adventures, monks a lot of times start to feel very squishy, because when everyone else is starting to upgrade to better kinds of armor, especially people that can wear heavy armor, they start upgrading from chainmail up to things like half plate or plate, and they start discovering magic armor, where they get a +1 or a +2 to their armor class just by wearing the armor. The monk has one of the lowest ACs at that point. And so a lot of people are like, well, that's not fair. The monk is super squishy. They're super easy to hit. They are underpowered. We need to change Unarmored Defense to allow them to use shields, or to allow them to wear light armor, just so they can get magic armor and be able to do that. And again, that misunderstands how the class is built. Of the 4 defining features, of the 4 features that exist in the first 2 levels, Unarmored Defense is the one that is most modified by the base class. Why? Because monks get a crap ton of things they can do that make them significantly harder to hit. So despite the fact they have a low armor class, there are so many things that monks can do that make them just as resilient as other characters, but in different ways, and you have to understand how to use it. Things like deflect missiles, ranged attacks, really hard to hit a monk with. While all other classes, if they get hit by ranged attacks, they're in trouble. Monks aren't. The only time that deflect missiles doesn't work is when you're getting spells cast at you, and they have other things to deal with that. When you get Ki, you get Patient Defense, which allows you to use your bonus action to make all attacks against you have disadvantage. That is a massive boon. Again, from a statistical standpoint, advantage or disadvantage is basically a plus or minus 3.5. So the ability to just turn on this thing gives you effectively an extra 3 or 4 armor class. The best magic armor you can get in the game is +3. So at level 2, Monks effectively have access to a +3 to their armor class. They already have their magic armor. You just have to understand when you need to use it. Slow Fall's another thing, makes them really hard to hit. Stunning Strike, because it affects action economy, means that they can get up close and personal with enemies, and they don't have to worry about getting attacked, whereas a Paladin getting up close and personal, they're going to get hit. When you get up to 7th level, you get Evasion. Magic attacks that require dex saves, which is a lot of them. If you make your dex save, which monks are really good at dex saves, you take no damage. Monks take less damage from spells. Purity of Body gives them immunity to poison, if I remember correctly, before I say the wrong thing. Yeah, immune to all disease and poison. That means they can't get the poison condition, and they also take no damage from poison damage. You're immune to poison damage. Going finally to Diamond Soul at 14th level, you actually have proficiency in all saving throws. My 17th level Shadow Monk, their lowest saving throw modifier is a +5. And that's their strength save. Everything else is higher than I think their wisdom save is a +11. Monks don't have a super high armor class, and there are a few things that they can do like bracers of defense they can actually wear to give them boosts to their armor class. Cloaks of protection, things like that, can give them boosts. So it's not that they are unable to increase their armor class. They don't need a high armor class. They're not designed to have a high armor class. They're designed to be able to deal with a lot of things and evade a lot of things. They're not designed to block like every other class. So that is what Unarmored Defense is about. It's not about, oh, you can add your Dex and Wisdom to your armor class. That's useful, and both Dex and Wisdom are very, very useful for the monk, but that's not the entirety of Unarmored Defense. Unarmored Defense is improved continuously because of all the other things that you get built into the monk. So if you are building a monk subclass and you want to modify the armored defense, understand you need to look at the rest of the class features and figure out how is this going to change how the rest of the class features work. Because if you give a monk heavy armor, and then they also get evasion, and they also get eventually they get empty body at 18th level, where they have resistance to all damage and they're invisible. Being in heavy armor means they're almost invincible at that point. High level monks are remarkably difficult to hurt and kick a kill. So understand, Unarmored Defense is not just, well, we need to give them a bone because we won't let them wear armor. It interacts with most of the defensive abilities of the rest of the class. Their armor class is not based entirely on their AC number. It is based on all the other abilities they have, and it's also based on how many actions they have available. Deflect missiles takes your reaction. So if you used your reaction for an opportunity attack, you're not going to be able to deflect missiles. Your armor class lowers. See, that's what makes the monk so complicated. It's one of the reasons I enjoy playing the monk so much, because every choice that you make, you have to weigh your options. And Unarmored Defense is exactly why you need to. It is the base aspect of being a monk, is this idea of, you know what? Your defenses are not going to be based on your armor. They're going to be based on how smartly you play your monk. And Unarmored Defense exemplifies that. Next, we have martial arts. Martial arts, another one of the most misunderstood aspects of the monk, because if you look at just the martial arts die and the number of attacks you make, you will mistake martial arts for being a damage dealing ability, and it's not. It never has been. It was never designed to be that. Martial arts is not meant to deal damage. The reason that your martial arts die gets bigger as you go on is so that the damage is a part of it, but it is not the sole purpose. And if it didn't get bigger as you went, the class itself would become very underpowered very, very quickly, because all the other things that martial arts gives you gives you diminishing returns the further you go on. So the basics of martial arts. Martial arts gives you 3 things that it changes about your class. Or technically 4. The first thing it does is right in the first level, it mentions unarmed strikes and monk weapons. Monk weapons is something unique to monks. That's why this is a defining feature. You cannot get proficiency in monk weapons with any sort of feat or anything, because monk weapons are defined by the martial arts feature. So, only monks can use monk weapons. They are the only class in the entire game that gets to use monk weapons. Now, monk weapons are just short swords and any simple melee weapons that don't have the two-handed or heavy property. So it's not like this is a new genre of weapons. This is not a new classification of weapons. This is a subset of weapons that already exist that the monk can use differently. And again, when we talk about those things defining features, monk weapons are not something that is unique to the monk. Other classes can use the same weapons, but monks can use them differently than any other class. So, that's the first thing you get, is access to monk weapons. The second thing you get, you can use dexterity instead of strength for the attack and damage rolls of your unarmed strikes and monk weapons. This is a super important distinction, because a lot of people go, oh, monk weapons are finesse weapons. They're not. And Crawford and Perkins and a bunch of other people have said this was done intentionally. Finesse weapons allow you to make a melee attack or make an attack with a finesse weapon, which are exclusively melee weapons, but allows you to use your dexterity instead of your strength for attack and damage rolls. In earlier editions, finesse was actually a feat that you would take called weapon finesse, which allowed you, with certain weapons, to use your dexterity for the attack roll, but strength was still the damage roll. Now it's baked into the weapon itself. Just makes it a little bit easier and more simple, because why do you need a feat when it's not going to make it so every weapon you can do that? It's still a certain subset of weapons. Why does it need to be attached to a feat? No. So these are not finesse weapons. Finesse weapons interact with a few feats differently, and a few other class features and things like that differently than this does. This just says you can use your dexterity for, instead of strength, the attack and damage rolls of your unarmed strikes and monk weapons. It also means monks don't really need to worry about their strength score. Monks need a dexterity score, and monks need a wisdom score. If they also had to worry about their strength score, that would mean 3 of the 6 attributes would need to be relatively high. Old versions of monks needed this. 3rd edition, 2nd edition, 1st edition monks were evil, because in order to make the monk, make a monk character, you had to have, I think, 3 or 4 different ability scores. Of your 6 ability scores in original D&D, I think 4 of them had to be above a 14, and one of those had to be above a 15 or 16 at level 1. So you had to roll unbelievably high in order to make a monk. And it meant that early versions of monk were really, really weird and not balanced very well, and nobody played them because you couldn't roll high enough. 2nd edition, you had that distinction of monks still had the unarmored thing, but they used dexterity, and they used strength, and then they also used, sometimes they used wisdom, sometimes they didn't, but they were very heavy multi-attribute dependent classes. You move up to 3rd edition, you had the same problem. You generally, to hit, would be using your dexterity, because again, weapon finesse worked for monks that way. But to do damage, you had to have a high strength score, and it was really confusing. 4th edition, we don't talk about 4th edition monks. They were really confusing. Attribute-wise, they were a little bit more simple, but they were... We'll talk about those in the next video. And then going to 5th edition, they simplified things. Now you just need... Dexterity is your attack score. Wisdom is your save score. That's all you're ever going to need as a monk. The second thing you get is access to the martial arts die. You roll a d4 and place the normal damage of your unarmed strikes or monk weapon. Now, the unique thing about this, you can roll a d4 in place of the normal damage of your unarmed strike or monk weapon. Something that was extremely common in the early years of the Adventurers League, I don't know if they still do it, people that played monks would always get a quarterstaff. Because quarterstaffs are versatile weapons, meaning you could attack two-handed with it, and because it's not a two-handed weapon, the weapon didn't have the two-handed property; it had the versatile property. On your attack action, you could do a D8 of damage instead of the D4 from your unarmed strike right at level 1. And when you got extra attack at 5th level, you could do a D8 twice, because you could still make your unarmed strike as your bonus action while using a versatile weapon. So, when you're choosing a monk weapon, if you want to use a monk weapon, understand you don't have to use the martial arts die. And in general, it's going to be more beneficial until you get to that D8, generally, is when you just start ignoring weapon damage to the dice. You can replace your attack action attacks with the damage die of the weapon itself. So if you're using a short sword, D6 is going to be more useful than a D4. Things like that. So always understand the difference between can and you must, or where it doesn't use the word can, or it just says you roll a, that is a requirement. If it says can, that is a choice. And then this die changes as you gain monk levels. So yes, the martial arts die gets bigger and bigger. That also means if you're homebrewing something and it's going to interact with how the monk attacks, you have to understand if you add additional attacks in any way to the monk, as you get higher, those attacks become more and more problematic, because eventually monks get a D10 for their martial arts die, which is more powerful than any melee weapon aside from a great axe or a great sword, and they get to use it effectively one-handed. So it's kind of like using a longsword, the versatile mode, but one-handed, and getting a bunch more attacks and a bunch of other things you can do with your attacks. So if you are homebrewing a monk, understand additional attacks for a monk changes things much more drastically than it does for any class other than the fighter. So if your idea is, well, I want to give the monk the ability to make all these different attacks, you're going to have to put a lot of limitations on that, because of the fact that that martial arts die gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And because of monk weapons, that means they can use magic weapons and get benefits from magic weapons, but still get even more benefits from using a higher damage die. So doing something like a fling tongue short sword would give them the ability to do a significant amount of damage, because they can use their martial arts die in place of the regular weapon damage die. The additional damage is going to be the same it always is, and then they also get to add in additional attacks or anything like that. It also means modifying... Well, let's go to the last part. The last thing that happens is when you use the attack action with an unarmed strike or a monk weapon, it is very specifically worded, when you use the attack action and you attack with either an unarmed strike or a monk weapon. If you attack with anything else, like you just decide to use a non-monk weapon because you can, maybe you're using a rapier, because it's finesse, and so it's not that big a difference. This doesn't work with that because it has to be both the attack action and an unarmed strike or a monk weapon. You can make one unarmed strike as a bonus action. For example, we don't need to go into that. So those are the 4 things that martial arts does. The fact that your bonus action attack is an unarmed strike instead of being able to use a monk weapon is a big deal because of flurry of blows, which we'll talk about in a second when we get to key. Because of that, if your idea to change the monk in some way is to go, well, I'm going to let them use their bonus action to make attack with monk weapons, that massively changes how it works, specifically because of magic items. Again, right now, the monk doesn't get any more magic item based attacks than any other class. If you change it so that they their unarmed strike can use their monk weapon instead of an unarmed strike, their bonus action can use their monk weapon instead of an unarmed strike, you change how the class is played, and you have to watch out for that because interactions with magic items are going to drastically change. And the other thing is, a lot of the abilities of the monk require them to hit with an attack, something that is extremely common in most of most of the subclasses for monk is they will add on hit effects effectively. And that is that means if you change how flurry of blows or anything like that, you're also going to have to deal with all these other things that stack on top of this basic defining feature. That's why we call them defining features, because despite the fact that they're relatively simple when you get them, everything else in the class is stacked up top of these things. And if you change that base part, it affects everything else in the stack. So that's martial arts. The way of the open hand modifies martial arts significantly. The entire way of the open hand subclass is based around, let's really focus on the martial arts defining feature and make it really interesting and unique. We'll get to the specifics in the second half of this specific video, where I start going through these are some of the examples of changes. That's what way of the open hand is designed to modify, is the martial arts aspect. Everything about that subclass is based on interacting with martial arts. So if you are thinking of making a homebrew for the monk, and you're like, you know what, I want to change how martial arts work, start with Way of the Open Hand and see what they did there. And use that as a starting point of, okay, these are examples of how they changed it. How can I make it different? How can I do things that don't already exist? Because if it already exists in the game, you don't need to make something new. You simply just need to take the class that's already been, or the subclass that's already been designed. That is one of my biggest issues I will have with some subclasses and quite a few new classes, is what they're doing already exists in the game. It just requires more knowledge of the game than they had. Not that it's difficult to do or that it's hard to do or anything. They just didn't understand the game, and so they made this new class or subclass that does what they want when it already exists, and because they did it without the limitations that are built into the system, it doesn't work. It's either overpowered or underpowered, or it interacts with things in ways that it shouldn't. If you're going to be homebrewing for something, learn about what you are homebrewing. If you're going to make a new subclass for the monk, look through all the different monk subclasses that already exist and see what already exists in the game. Look at feats and what exists there. You don't want to make your subclass kind of obsolete simply because no one needs to take your subclass if they can make your subclass with a bunch of feats and maybe a multi-class or two. Because they will get more benefit from doing that than taking your subclass and not being able to take another one that's better designed. So That is martial arts. Moving on, we get to ki. Ki is the other big defining feature of the Monk in 5th edition. This is the one that most people think about. This is the one that most people try to mess with. Ki is a limited resource, and there actually are already rules in D&D about how powerful things should be compared to how many ki points they cost. The basic rule of thumb is if an ability you are creating gives you the ability to mimic the damage of a first level spell, it should cost a minimum of 2 ki points and go up from there. I believe in either the Dungeon Master's Guide or it might be there was a homebrew themed wow, I can't remember what the article series is called. I'm feeling super dumb right now. Hold on. Unearthed Arcana. There we go. Dear Lord. There was an Unearthed Arcana that came out years ago that talked about, if you want to homebrew, these are the things that you should look at. And it might have been in there. But there's an actual system of rules about the power of abilities and how many ki points they should take. Is it hard and fast where you always have to do this? Absolutely not. But it's a good starting point. So the ki system is just a limited resource you can use. And they give you 3 examples of some of the ways you can use it to kind of change how things work. Flurry of Blows is the most talked about version. Basically, immediately after you take the attack action on your turn, you can spend 1 ki point to make 2 unarmed strikes as a bonus action. Now, this does not require you to make unarmed strike or monk weapon attacks. It just says if you take the attack action, you can burn a ki point to make 2 unarmed strikes as a bonus action. This is where a lot of people think monks are supposed to be these powerhouse damage dealers. They're not. They're never meant to be. That's not what this is designed to be. Flurry of Blows gives you additional attacks which allow you to do more things. And we will see that in subclasses where they go, there will be specific things that require you to use Flurry of Blows to do it. Patient Defense, again, we talked about that is a modification of Unarmored Defense. It increases your armor class effectively. It's very, very useful. All of these are bonus action based. And then Step of the Wind, that is a modification of something we haven't talked about yet, but it's Unarmored Movement. Ki is the perfect example of how you modify defining features while still being a defining feature. It basically means that the monks, one of the monks' defining features is modifying other defining features. Like that is what the monk is built upon, is this idea that we can do certain things that allows you to modify what you can do with these defining features. It means that you need to understand the defining features really well, but it gives you so much ability to do really interesting, cool things. It's another reason why I enjoy playing a monk, because they always have choices. Ki allows them to make more choices. So, yes. Ki. The subclass in the PHB that modifies Ki is the Way of the Four Elements, and it does it really poorly. Again, we'll talk about it a little later in the video, but Way of the Four Elements is probably the weakest of these subclasses. I've talked about there is a redesigned version of the Way of the Four Elements monk that works a lot better, but the basics of the Way of the Four Elements is giving you different ways to use your Ki. Again, it's modifying a defining feature. In this case, it's the limited resource. So yeah. Finally, we get to the last defining feature, Unarmored Movement. This is the one that most people overlook because they don't think it means anything. Oh, they're faster. Who cares? Well, when we talk about action economy, I've mentioned this before, action economy is a super important thing in 5th edition specifically because there are very, very, very few things that give you additional actions in combat. There is less than a handful of magic items that will modify that. And outside of the monk, there's not a ton of things that really mess with the action economy. It tends to be relatively static. And because of that, anything that makes any modification to the action economy can make a huge impact. Movement is one of your actions. It's the one that most people ignore. And they shouldn't. I had a really long conversation on the Final Fantasy XIV D&D crossover Reddit, where someone was talking about the Gunbreaker, and one of their abilities gave them basically a dash action. And they said, well, this is super, super underpowered because this is just, and they did all this math and stuff like that. I said, well, yeah, if the only thing you're worrying about is how much damage the class can do, then yeah, you're right. However, tabletop RPGs are not based on who can do the most damage per second. That is a video game thing. And it's a great measurement for a video game. It is not a great measurement for a tabletop RPG because winning an encounter doesn't have to end simply because you reduce the other enemy's hit points to 0. And the only way to reduce their hit points is not making attacks. There are so many other things you can do in a tabletop RPG to defeat an encounter. Even a combat encounter where the enemy is not willing to surrender or anything like that. So you are going to have to kill them. There are so many more things that you can do in a tabletop RPG than you can do in a video game. And having additional actions in 5th edition, no matter what they are, or just more effective actions, is always a benefit for your team. So unarmored movement means that the monk generally tends to be a melee-based class. If you can't get to a creature to attack them, you're going to waste other actions and your bonus action, which is a bad thing. So unarmored movement in its base aspect allows you to always get use out of your out of your abilities. Now, when you combine the fact that your hits do things, the additional movement does even more, because just being able to use your attack, if you are viewing a battlefield as my team has this many hit points and the enemy team has this many hit points, it doesn't matter which enemy you attack. As long as you are reducing their overall hit point total, you're making a benefit. Once you start dealing with how many actions each side has, it actually does matter who you attack. If this person only has 10 hit points, but this one has 50 hit points, it's more beneficial to target the one with less hit points, because once they're out, that team loses all the actions that are associated with that particular character. So unarmored movement ensures not only that you can get to an enemy, it means that you can get to the right enemy or the right place. Again, not all of D&D, even D&D combat. If we are just looking at this as a combat simulator, not everything is about doing damage. Sometimes it's being in the right place, interacting with the right object, or blocking the right doorway. You can stop the enemy from being able to use their actions by simply having your monk stand in a doorway and they can't get past you, and using patient defense. I've actually used that in games, and it makes the enemy team lose actions because I have to waste them attacking my monk with disadvantage. So, additional movement is really useful if you understand the system, and that's what unarmored movement is about. It links into Unarmored Defense because, again, you're not allowed to wear armor or use a shield when using Unarmored Movement. And the other thing that I think a lot of people don't understand about movement is also just being able to be faster than your enemy means they won't be able to hit you. So we talk about that Unarmored Defense, and, well, monks have such low armor class. Yeah, but they're a lot harder to hit. Just because their armor class is low doesn't mean that they're going to take more blows unless you're playing them dumb. Which I did with my Shadow Monk for, I want to say, almost a year. It took me a year to really figure out, oh, that patient defense is a lot more useful than I thought it was. I would always bamf into the middle of combat, punch a bunch of people, try to get a stun off, and then fail because That's how my life works. And then I would take 14 attacks and I would be unconscious. Unarmored movement is more than just, oh, they're faster. It gives you a lot more choices on how you're going to play your character and exactly where you're going to put your character to be the most beneficial. Even something like picking, moving your monk to be next to the character that the rogue wants to get their sneak attack against is a huge benefit. That is a difference between, a D8 of damage and a D8 plus 5d6 damage. Like, that is a huge, huge difference, and the only difference in that is where you're standing, which is entirely governed by unarmored movement. In the player's handbook, the Way of Shadow modifies unarmored movement. Well, what do you mean by that? That doesn't make sense. If you look at the abilities of the Way of Shadow, and I guess this is a really good time to transition into, okay, let's go to examples of how you can modify these things. So we're going to work backward because I really like Way of Shadow and we're already there. If we go to the Way of Shadow Monk, at 3rd level when you choose this, you get what's called Shadow Arts. You can use your key to cast some spells. Now, if you look at this just at its face, what does that mean? Well, it means that this is modifying the defining feature of key. It's giving you different uses for your key. And you are technically right, but when you look at the abilities that it gives you, this is things that actually modify. These are controllable abilities, and when you combine them with unarmored movement, they really do allow you to control the battlefield. As an action, you can spend 2 key points to cast Darkness, Dark Vision, Pass Without a Trace, or Silence without providing material components, and additionally you gain the Minor Illusion cantrip if you don't already know it. So you get access to a cantrip. I never used the Minor Illusion cantrip. I completely forgot I had it. There are so many situations that I think back to when I go, shit, if I'd used Minor Illusion, that would have been super, super useful. How does the Minor Illusion cantrip add to your unarmored movement? It allows you to move the exact places that you want to. Minor Illusion can be used to distract people. Minor Illusions can be used to manipulate people. It can effectively be used to create a corridor so that you can get the most out of your movement. Darkness works the same way. Dark Vision is not just useful for yourself. One of the things I used to do in Adventures League games is when we started an adventure or an adventuring day, I would go, okay, who here doesn't have the dark vision? And we'd always have at least 1 or 2 people. It's like, well, I don't. I go, okay. And I'd go, foo, foo, foo. I'd use my cool ninja powers and I'd touch them. Then they'd have dark vision for 8 hours. Dark vision doesn't require concentration. So I could cast it on as many people as I want. And I would just go, we need to wait an hour before we go anywhere. Because I get all my ki back on a short rest. So we'd wait an hour. Dark vision lasts for 8. So we would still have 7 hours of an entire party having dark vision. Meaning we needed no lamps. We needed no lights. We needed nothing. We could travel entirely without anything that would give off our position, meaning my ability to move exactly where I wanted to was never going to be hampered by the necessity of being able to see. We look at Pass Without a Trace. Now we don't leave tracks, we make very little noise, and our stealth checks are +10. Again, that is a modification to your movement. That means you can get to the exact place you want to be before combat starts. This allows you at the beginning of combat to effectively move your character wherever you want on the battlefield before initiative is rolled. And then silence is another thing that is remarkably useful because it prevents you from making noise, which Pass Without a Trace kind of works that way, but not really. Or it prevents your enemy from making noise. Meaning you put silence on an area, you could go in and kill someone, and no one is the wiser because literally no sounds come from it. All of these things are very much stealth based, and stealth itself is a movement based ability. A lot of people don't quite see it that way, but it 100%. Stealth is all about being able to get exactly where you want without interference. So all of these abilities, as much as yes, they use key points to do, are modifying your unarmored movement by allowing you to get the most out of the movement that you have. When we move up to 6th level, you get Shadow Step. Your bonus action allows you to teleport 60 feet. If you don't understand how that affects unarmored movement, you don't understand movement. You just got an additional 60 feet of movement at level 6. That is double the movement speed of any other class other than the barbarian at that level. So as a bonus action, you can you effectively get the use of a move action and a dash action as long as there are shadows available to you. And if you combine it with shadow arts, you can cast darkness and you can see where the darkness is. You can't see in the darkness. Magical darkness negates dark vision. You have to have a special version of dark vision in order to work, and the monk doesn't get it on purpose. But if you are in an area where there's a shadow, but you have just this huge area where there's no shadows, you can cast darkness. And darkness is cast on an object. It is not cast on a point in space. So you can cast it on a rock or something, throw it, and you won't be able to see through the darkness, but you can see an area of darkness. You can shadow step into it, to the very edge of it, and then step out and punch people. Shadow Step also gives you advantage on your first melee attack before the end of your turn, which also means that it's super useful in making sure that you're getting the hits that you need to. But all of these, again, are meant to modify your unarmored movement. Again, with Shadow Step, it ensures that you can get to the exact place you want to go. Your movement is never going to be wasted. And now that you have Shadow Step, you especially aren't. Shadow Step, another thing that a lot of people don't seem to understand is they look at combat in D&D as 2 dimensions. And it's not. It is 3-dimensional. Shadow Step is not a lateral distance. I've shadow stepped onto the tops of buildings from ground level. I have shadow stepped into the branches of trees. I have shadow stepped from balcony to balcony, from rooftop to rooftop. Shadow step increases your mobility to 3 dimensions instead of 2. And at 9th level, you also get the ability to run on walls, so that increases that unarmored movement, that ability to go exactly the way you want to go, and be able to avoid the things you don't want to deal with. One of the times that I kind of annoyed a DM was there was a puzzle where there was the door was behind this large set of bars, and the bars were meant to open by these 2 buttons that were on opposite sides of this wall, and the room itself was about, I think it was about 60 feet wide. The only way to get to these buttons was there was a small bar that went across the room, and then there was another bar that was balanced on top of it. And the way the puzzle was supposed to be solved was you would get 2 characters that had to balance and get acrobatics checks to get out there, and then they had to slowly, as one, move out so that neither one tipped it over. I went, oh, don't worry about that. Generally, it's supposed to take at least a couple of turns because it takes a while to get there. And if you fall off, there is lava below you with a bunch of demons. Like it was really, really nasty stuff down there. And while you're doing that, you also have these things flying around trying to attack you that are going to try and knock you off into the lava. It is not a great thing. So what do? I go, okay, I'm going to run along the wall because the buttons weren't that far out. I believe they were only like 15 or 20 feet out. Longer than you would be able to make with a jump. But I literally ran across the wall, hit the first button, teleported to the other side, hit the second button, and the only way those bars rose at the end was if both buttons were hit within the same round. Because you couldn't do, you weren't supposed to be able to do it within the same turn. Well, that's what I did. And the Dungeon Master actually had to rewrite, which he wasn't allowed to do in this Broke Adventures League rules, and it annoyed the hell out of me because I didn't read the adventure before I played it, which you shouldn't do. But my solution was a valid solution. But he rewrote it to not allow teleportation in there. And he actually made me roll a saving throw to see if I could actually teleport. And I made the saving throw, and what's supposed to happen is the teleport's supposed to happen as normal. And if you fail it, you get knocked into a different dimension, which is super cool. I made it, and he's like, well, no, it didn't work. So I ran back. But, again, that extra mobility was really, really essentially important. So yeah, that's what Shadow Step is. It modifies your unarmored movement. Cloak of Shadows allows you to turn invisible if you're in an area of dim light or darkness. Invisibility, and again, invisibility helps your movement because people can't stop you. You don't provoke opportunity attacks. You can't be targeted by things that require line of sight. These are all things that make it easier for you to move. It's also nice that doesn't require key points. That used to piss off the dungeon masters. And then Opportunist is the only thing that doesn't modify unarmored movement, but as an ultimate ability, it's still really useful. Whenever a creature within 5 feet of you is hit by an attack made by a creature other than you, you can use your reaction to make a melee attack against that creature. It basically just gives you another way to use your reaction. I don't think it's quite as useful as the other things in here because, first of all, it doesn't modify unarmored movement. And there's so many other things that you can use your reaction for as a monk that there's a lot of times that it's just not worth it to use it to make an attack. But there's a lot of times when it is really worth it for that. So it's a decent thing. So if you are looking to modify the unarmored movement to make an even more hypermobile style class, if you want a class that is built around the idea of just being able to always be moving around the battlefield, that is what the Way of Shadow Monk is. And it synergizes with unarmored movement perfectly. That is exactly what you want to see. Every single thing here modifies that unarmored movement by allowing you to get the most out of your movement. Always, always, always. So again, if you are homebrewing for the monk, and you don't have to have a subclass that exclusively focuses only on one defining feature, but the features of the subclass should connect to a defining feature. It doesn't have to all connect to the same defining feature, but they should somehow interact with defining features all throughout the subclass. The Way of Shadow is a perfect example of how to modify the unarmored movement defining feature. Shadow Arts gives you the ability to get the most out of your movement by being able to manipulate the battlefield. So battlefield control will modify your movement. Shadow Step just gives you more movement. And it adds an additional dimension to your movement. And then Cloak of Shadows gives you uninterrupted movement. Gives you the ability to move exactly where you want to. So that is a way to modify the character itself into being able to get the most out of that ability. So those are just 3 different examples of the different ways you can modify a defining ability. You can modify how the environment interacts with the ability. You can make the ability stronger, or you can modify how the character interacts with the environment. Those are the 3 kind of different ways that you can modify it, and that's a perfect example of it. So, moving backwards to go with the way of the 4 elements. This again modifies ki. And this is a perfect example of what not to do. Effectively, you have a really good example of how to add spells into the things like that, spell-like effects to this. and how to turn key points into kind of a version of the magic points system. That's what this is supposed to be. The problem with Way of the Four Elements Monk is you don't have a ton of choices. And so a lot, with the fact that you have all these different things here, a lot of them are not really going to be that useful. And most of these abilities tend to be damage related abilities, and they don't really interact with the rest of the kit of the monk. Again, the monk is not meant to be a damage dealing class. It's meant to be a control based class. There are so few kind of control based abilities in here that are worth using the key points required to do them. Things like Hold Person. Hold Person is a really, really useful second level spell. It costs 3 key points to cast, and it's a wisdom save. And it can last for up to a minute. Now, the paralyzed condition is really, really bad, and that's what Hold Person does. Because you lose your action, your movement, your bonus action, and your reaction as long as you're paralyzed, and any attacks made within 5 feet, any melee attacks made within 5 feet of a paralyzed character that hit it are auto crits. It is an extremely useful thing. However, it only affects one person, and it costs 3 key points. And there's a very good chance that it's not going to last more than 1 or 2 rounds, because they get a chance to save out of it at the end of every turn. So if they fail the initial one, they might save right when their turn comes around. And it might be that this person, they might be the next person in initiative. So you only really get rid of 1 round of them being able to do things. Stunning Strike, on the other hand, only costs 1 key point. It still requires a saving throw. Use a con save instead of a wisdom save. And there's a lot less creatures that have high constitution scores than there are creatures that have high wisdom scores. It lasts until the end of your next turn. It has nothing to do with the character that you're hitting. So you're always going to get, bare minimum, a full round plus your turn of them being gone. So, well, yeah, Hold Person is an extremely useful spell. It's a great control spell. When you look at the other things that the monk can do, there are very few situations where a Hold Person spell is going to be more beneficial than 3 Stunning Strikes. And that's what you have to weigh it against, is 3 key points is 3 Stunning Strikes. Something else like Cone of Cold is 6 key points. That is 6 stunning strikes. 6 key points is 12 unarmed attacks from Flurry of Blows. That is 6 rounds of disadvantage of attacks against you using Patient Defense. Like, there's so many things that 6 points could do that Cone of Cold, which is a 5th level spell, does 8d8 cold damage. And it's a large area. There are better things that you can do than Cone of Cold. And as you look at it, like, a lot of times the most useful things in here are not spells. They're the ones that are unique abilities. Like Elemental Attunement is a really interesting, fun role-playing ability. Fangs of the Fire Snake is really, really useful. It costs a little bit too much key in order to be really effective, but it's more useful in most of the other things. Fist of Unbroken Air is another one that, instead of just replicating a spell effect, they give you something that's interesting and allows you to push a creature up to 20 feet and knock it prone. Those are control abilities. Those work well. But like Gong of the Summit lets you cast the Shatter Spell. Shatter Spell is not that useful a spell. It only affects a 10 foot by 10 foot square. So it's not, up to 4 people can get hit by it. Doesn't do it to a ton of damage. It's not that useful. Gaseous Form isn't that great. Ride the Wind lets you cast Fly, which again isn't that useful because you're a melee character. So flying isn't that great. And by the time you can get Ride the Wind 11th level, you can already run on walls. So you already have a 3rd dimension of movement. Fly isn't going to be that useful for you. If you are going to be modifying the key, if you're going to be giving new ways to use your key points, that's what you want to do. Is you want to make, basically, you want to make a martial arts kind of wizard, kind of thing, which is much different than our Western version of wizard. If you look at the things like, oh, what's it called? Is it the Forbidden Kingdom? Yes, Forbidden Kingdom, film with Jet Li and Jackie Chan. I really enjoy it. It's not the greatest film ever, but I love Jackie Chan, and I love Jet Li. But in it, the main bad guy has magic, and he can do a lot of really, really interesting things with it. The idea, in, like, again, the monk is based on kind of the Chinese folklore version of martial artists. And in Chinese folklore and Asian folklore in general, you did have these magic using characters. And the magic in general was almost entirely based on their ability to control their martial arts. Their martial arts made them so powerful that they could do magical things. So the idea of a magic using monk has historical historical roots, and it fits into what the monk was designed to do. However, if you're not just, again, just giving a monk the ability to cast wizard spells, you can do that pretty easily. Just have them multi-class into a wizard. Like, that's not difficult to do. Or if you don't want to also need a high intelligence score, have them multi-class into druid, which lets you use your wisdom and gives you a lot of very similar spells. They're more nature themed, but you can reflavor them. Like, just multi-class into a druid if you want a spell casting monk. However, if you want a martial arts sorcerer, as in the kind of sorcerers that show up in wuxia films and Asian mythology and folklore and things like that, well, that's what Way of the Four Elements was meant to kind of emulate. Mostly was meant to emulate something a little more similar to like Avatar: The Last Airbender. But even if you look at that, the airbending, think about magic as it relates to air bending and water bending and things like that, where this shouldn't just be replicating spells. It should be your control of your body is so great that you can actually control the elements around you in some way. I'm not saying don't give them access to spells that already exist, but understand that the monk itself is meant to be a control-based class. So if you're going to give them access to spells, give them access to control-based spells that are not going to do things that they can already do. Again, when we look at Hold Person is an incredibly useful control spell, but they already have something that does something very similar in Stunning Strike. So giving them Hold Person effectively gives them the ability to do something extremely similar with some minor changes. Very useful changes, but they already have an ability very similar to that. And the problem with that is going to be, well, they're going to measure, is one Hold Person worth 3 Stunning Strikes? And it almost never is going to be. There are certain situations where it is. Like if you're fighting a stone giant, you're never going to get a Stunning Strike off on them. You're just not. You might be able to get a Hold Person because they're not remarkably wise. But they tend to have really, really high Constitution scores. So that would be the only time when Hold Person is good. So if you're going to be modifying ki, use the example of the Way of the Four Elements, but understand you should focus a little bit more on giving them unique abilities as opposed to just, here's some magic, because there's already ways to give monks magic. Let them multi-class, let them take one of the many feats that give them access to spells. Like there's so many other ways that you can give them access to magic. To create a subclass that is just designed to give them access to magic is not necessary and is not going to be very useful. But if you want to emulate that idea of those kind of martial arts sorcerers from, wuxia movies and things like that, then yeah, go ahead and use this as a guide. But remember, you want to give control-based abilities. You want to give them the ability to manipulate the battlefield or manipulate themselves or manipulate their allies. Something in there to do cool things with. Finally, going back to the first thing we talked about, the way of the open hand. The way of the open hand modifies martial arts. Well, how does it do that? Well, we have open hand technique. Basically, anytime you hit a creature with an attack granted by flurry of blows, you can impose one of the following effects on the target. So, anytime you use flurry of blows gives you 2 attacks. So, every turn, you can do 2 of these things. And there's no limit to how often you can do these things as long as you're doing flurry of blows. So, you have, it must succeed on a dex save or be knocked prone. It must make a strength save. If it fails, you can push it up to 15 feet away from you, or it can't take reactions until the end of your turn. All of these are control abilities, and all of them proc after hitting with a flurry of blows. So, this is the kind of thing that when you're talking about modifying martial arts, adding on-hit abilities tends to be really useful and really fun. Specifically if you tie it to flurry of blows, because it gives it a limiting factor. If you're not going to tie it to flurry of blows, you probably need to give a limited number of uses for them. And these are perfect examples of things you can do. You can knock a target prone. You can move the target. Or you can remove their ability to take certain kinds of actions. Reactions are the lowest impact of the actions that you can take away from an enemy. If you're thinking of like hierarchy of what actions are going, if you remove them from a target, what are going to make the biggest change to how things work? The action itself, if you can stop them from using their action in some way, that is going to make the largest effect on how combat goes. Because the action is the thing that they use every single turn. They may not always use their movement. They may not always use their bonus action. They will always use their action. So anything that prevents them from using their action or forces them to use a certain action is going to have the largest impact on the game and should have the most constraints on it. Going down one level, the movement and the bonus action are kind of along the same thing because there are quite a few turns where you're not going to use your movement if you're close enough to hit them, or you're not going to use your bonus action because not every single monster has a bonus action that they can use. So making them so they can't move or they can't use their bonus action, both of those are going to have similar effects. Bonus action, I would say, is slightly more simply because movement is technically never going to do damage. Movement is just going to allow them to use another action. So we go action, bonus action, just barely above movement, and then reaction. Reactions are the actions that are used the least in 5th edition D&D, and in general, monsters use them more than players do. Because opportunity attacks are a thing, and it's extremely rare in most combat encounters for enemies to ever really want to retreat. Most combat encounters, enemies are only designed to exist for that combat encounter, so it doesn't matter. They're actually designed to die. Whereas players, they don't want to die, so they may retreat. They may have abilities that work better when they're further away. So being able to remove its ability to use reactions tends to be a little bit more impactful on monsters than it is if a monster was to do the exact same thing to you. And again, one of the most useful ways to use this is against enemy spellcasters. If an open hand monk goes up to an enemy spellcaster, pops them, they don't get a save for reactions. The other 2 abilities they have, they can make a save and it won't affect them. But this, there's no save. And it lasts until the end of your next turn. So it's automatically going to exist for a round, a full round. And for spellcasters, counterspell is really, really devastating. If you go up and bop a spellcaster, remove their ability to take reactions, they can no longer no longer counterspell your spellcasters. If there's multiple spellcasters, you can just run around and twice per turn you can flurry of blows 2 of them and just remove their ability to take reactions. So in that particular instance, your ability to move is going to be essential in getting to the spellcasters so that you can remove their ability to counterspell. So see, all these things work together. Wholeness of body is just a heal thing, and the reason it exists is it is something that monks have been able to do since I know I know it happened in 2nd edition. I don't know if they had a heal ability in for 1st edition, but the open hand is supposed to be your traditional monk, so that's why they have that. It doesn't really affect the martial arts thing itself. It's just a heal ability. Tranquility is another thing that doesn't seem like it affects the martial arts ability, but it really does. Because what it does, it basically means that at the start of or at the end of any long rest, so at the beginning of your day, you effectively get a sanctuary spell cast on you, which means enemies can't make attacks against you unless they succeed on a wisdom save. So you are untargetable, which means now this ends as soon as you make an attack. So it means generally the first combat of the day, you can move wherever you want because they can't make opportunity attacks either. Again, no attacks against you whatsoever unless they make their wisdom save. So this means that you can go and get to the exact right person you want to get your first attack to be exactly what you want it. Now, tranquility, you can argue that it modifies the movement, unarmored movement as well, because it allows you to get the most out of your movement. Me personally, it doesn't feel as much as useful because literally the first time you make an attack, the sanctuary spell is gone and you never get it back until the next day. I'd much rather having a way for you to get it back with key or something. But yeah, so that's what that is. And finally, the 17th level ability is Quivering Palm. Basically, if you hit somebody, has to be with an unarmed strike, can't use a monk weapon for it. Hits them with an unarmed strike, you can burn 3 key points to kill them effectively. You burn 3 key points and they have a vibration in their body. And then if you use your action anytime in the next number of days equal to your monk level, so it's 17, in the next 2 weeks, as long as you're on the same plane of existence, you can use an action to just kill them. They make a con save. They fail it. They're reduced to 0 hit points. They succeed. They take 10d10 necrotic damage. This is the ultimate modification of action economy, because this doesn't matter how many hit points they have. If you can get them to fail this as a saving throw, you win. They're instantly taken to 0 hit points. This is effectively, this is especially effective against legendary creatures, because if you hit them, it does take, you have to hit them, and then your next turn you have to use your action to activate it. So this is a minimum of a 2-turn ability. But if you do that, either they have to use a legendary resistance or they have to die. Those are the only 2 things that you get out of this. So using Quivering Palm in combination with other allies using spells that really force the enemy to use up their legendary resistance. Something that I used to do a lot is I would specifically target legendary creatures with stunning strikes. Not because I thought I was going to stun them, but because anytime they failed, they would use their legendary resistance to not. Because if they are stunned, they can't use any legendary actions either. Which, stunning a legendary creature not only takes out their actions, it takes out all their legendary actions. Which is a huge, huge balancing aspect of 5th edition. So, again, this is all based on the idea of what can I do to make martial arts more powerful. Well, in this particular instance, martial arts can now end a creature. All of these things relate back to martial arts. So if you are going to be making a homebrew for the monk that modifies the martial arts, this is a really good example of what you can do. On-hit abilities tend to be really useful for monks because they get a lot of attacks. If you're doing something that is especially powerful, if you tie it to Flurry of Blows, that does limit it in a really effective manner. Because it limits it to key usage, you have to have key points in order to do it. And it means that in order to do it, they have to use their attack action. They have to make an attack with a monk weapon or an unarmed strike. So it means that it can't be combined with spell casting or other, unique abilities or using a magic item or anything like that. If you tie it to Flurry of Blows, none of those things can happen. So you can really curtail it and make these abilities really powerful and useful without it being overpowered, because those limitations are already baked into the base class. So one of the reasons why you need to understand the system before you start modifying it. Because if you didn't realize that and you just went, well, I'm going to tie this to Flurry of Blows because that's a monk thing, you're not going to understand that that also means it can't interact with anything that uses your action. Anytime you use your action for something other than making an attack, using the attack action, you cannot use Flurry of Blows, and therefore you cannot use any of those abilities that are tied to Flurry of Blows. So understanding the class is essential to being able to understand and modify it in an effective and fun way. And again, when you're making homebrew subclasses for the monk, you want to do things that are going to be different, that are going to make it feel different. That's what you want. So, really long video, but I think a really important one. Final thoughts. Overall, like I said, the monk is my favorite 5th edition class because it is such a complex class. There are so many choices that you get to make. You have limited resources, and anytime you lose one of those limited resources, you have to choose what is the best way to use it, because you always have a lot of choices on how to use it. If you are homebrewing something for the monk is not a damage dealer. If you try to turn it into a damage dealer, you're not going to have fun, because you're going to have to fight against how the rest of the class is designed. But it is an exceptional control class. The 4 things that all of your homebrew subclass abilities should somehow modify, at least one of them, are Unarmored Defense, which again is mostly modified by the base class, Martial Arts, which benefits highly from on-hit kind of attack to the things, Ki, which is a limited resource that you can do a lot of different things with, and then Unarmored Movement, which is a control ability. The ability to get to wherever you want is absolutely essential, and modifying Unarmored Movement can turn into really interesting, fun things. So, that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this very, very deep dive into the monk itself and the things that you can homebrew for it. The next episode, we're going to look at a few of the other ones. I'm not going to go through every single subclass. I'm going to talk about a few of the subclasses that exist that do different things, just to give you more ideas of these are things that have already been done. Use them as templates. Use them as ideas to give you things that you can change to make the monk play very, very differently. And then we're also going to talk about monks from different systems, monks from different editions of D&D, monks from different things, going into pop culture, going into movies, things like that, just to give us ideas of things that haven't been done in 5th edition already, to maybe give you some ideas about what you might want to make your homebrew about. But that you can be all for me today. As always, if you're enjoying this, like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, and turn notifications on in the comments down below. Probably the thing I'm most interested in right now, if you made it this far, is this an interesting series? I want to do this for every single class. I already have at least one collaboration where I'm going to bring someone else in to get some different ideas. I want to know, is this interesting information? And most of all, do you think this is useful information for you? Is this giving you ideas about how you might be able to make your own homebrews, or maybe not even make your own homebrews, but be able to judge other homebrews to be able to use in games that you run, games that you play, being able to pitch homebrews to your DMs, going, hey, listen, this is the homebrew I want to play, and this is why it's going to work, and this is why it's not going to be unbalanced, and it's going to be fun. Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, again, that's all for me today, and I'll see you guys in the next time. All right? Bye-bye.